Hello everybody, this is my next literature revision video based on A Christmas Carol, and this is going to be focused on the structure and the plot of the text. So the 7 key areas that I'll be talking about today, the overall importance of the title and the analogy of a song that Dickens uses, just a very quick plot overview, the past, present and future and how that's used structurally in the text, just a very overall structure kind of slide here for you as well. Then we'll be looking at the aspect of the cyclical structure in the text and how stave 1 very much links up to stave 5. Then we'll be looking at whether it's non-chronological or chronological or both, and the use of time in the text. And then we'll be talking about the fact that Dickens uses a third-person narrator and just a little bit about that narrator and the kind of tone that it sets. So the title is very important in this text, A Christmas Carol. A carol is a type of Christian song that's sung at Christmas time. These songs often encourage feelings of charity, kindness and goodwill to all. So it's quite a religious connotation that Dickens clearly wanted to have here, and it links in with this wider purpose that he wanted to spread the Christmas spirit and encourage people to be kinder to one another. And he doesn't just apply this to the title. Each chapter of the book is called a stave, and a stave is actually the name given to one of these lines that appears on musical script. And as you can see, there are 5 staves that appear here, just like the 5 chapters in the text. So it very much links into this overall analogy that the book is supposed to be like a song and that he's singing it at Christmas time to make people just that little bit kinder to each other. And what's more, singing and music is a motif that carries on heavily throughout the whole text itself. There's lots of examples of people enjoying music, singing, for example, in the miner's cottage, at Fred's Christmas party, the Christmas carolers at the beginning of the text, just the boy who sings at Scrooge's door and gets the ruler thrown at him. And then, of course, at the end of the text, there's kind of links there of how that changes and Scrooge thinks more favourably of music overall as well. So I know there's a lot of text on this slide, but just in a nutshell, the text opens with an introduction to Ebenezer Scrooge. He's a cruel, avaricious, heartless old man. He's very rude to everybody that he meets, including his own family. That night, when he returns home, he's visited by the ghost of his old friend and business partner, Jacob Marley, who actually died 7 years ago that day. Marley warns him that if he doesn't change, he will suffer the same fate that he currently is suffering. And he discusses the chains that he has attached to him. He tells Scrooge that his own chain was that long 7 years ago. So he tells Scrooge, imagine how long your chain is now, how ponderous it is now. And he very much tells him, you have to try and right the wrongs of your life now before you get to the stage that I got to. Otherwise, your afterlife is going to be one that is miserable. And he tells him that he'll be visited by 3 ghosts. And of course, that does happen in the text. So in stave 2, we have the ghost of Christmas past. This shows him various things from his own past, which I'll talk about on the next slide. Then in stave 3, we have the ghost of Christmas present that takes him around showing him things that are happening right now on that Christmas day that Scrooge is about to wake up to. And then the ghost of Christmas yet to come is in stave 4. That's a very, very kind of morbid stave showing Scrooge a man that has died, an anonymous man that has died, and how people react to that death. And of course, most of it is very unfavourable. And he shows Scrooge the positive and negative effects that his own death would bring ultimately when we find out at the end of that stave that, of course, that dead man was Scrooge. And then stave 5, the end of the story, the resolution of the story. This is when Scrooge discovers the true meaning of Christmas. He discovers the fact that he has to be a better person. He has to take on more social responsibility. And we very much have this redemption and this transformation in Scrooge into a more generous and kind-hearted human being. So this is what I wanted to talk about in terms of the past, present and future, and this element of kind of time and how all 3 of these are equally important to Scrooge. And I'll talk about that in a minute as well. On this slide, it's a lot of information. I'm not going to read it all out to you in this video. You can read it on the PowerPoint for yourselves. But I've kind of given you all of what happens in each stave. And all of the things that Scrooge is shown. So, for example, in stave 2, he's shown a few different scenes of him at school. Then he's shown him at Fezziwigs. Then he's shown the breakup with Belle. And then Belle, a few years later, happy with a large family and a loving husband. Stage 3, again, I've kind of just listed here for you all of the key moments, all of the key things that Scrooge is shown. And then the same again for stage 4. And I've tried to break it down into these kind of separate moments or separate visits that the ghosts take him on. So have a look at this, because I think this is a really kind of nice way of looking at these individual moments that Scrooge is shown. And I just want to talk about the overall structure. Some of you may have heard of this graph before. This is called Freytag's pyramid. So the spelling of that is here for you. So Freytag's pyramid shows us the kind of typical structure of a text. And you've probably seen this before with your teachers, and I think you certainly would have seen it at Key Stage 3. You might have heard it called the story mountain at Key Stage 3, but it is actually from this, this theory of Freytag's pyramid. So the theory being that you start with an exposition, so the kind of introduction, you have lots of things introduced, like the setting, the characters, and then you have this thing called the inciting incident, and something that happens that kind of sparks the main action. So you might have heard this called a catalyst or something like that. And if you think about what that could be in this text, we'll be talking about that in a minute, but really it's Marley's visit. When Marley comes to speak to Scrooge, that is what sets everything else in motion. And you can think about your other literature texts with Freytag's pyramid as well, and I'll be talking about that in my other videos. So if you think about Macbeth, the inciting incident there is the witches telling him the 3 prophecies. If you think about Inspector Calls, it's when the inspector arrives and tells them that a girl has died. So there's always something that happens that kind of sparks the action and gets things into motion. Then the next section is the rising action. This is when things start to happen. The character and the protagonist in particular starts to go through something, starts on his journey or her journey. And then this all leads up to a climax, so the highest point of tension or drama in a text, or it's often the moment of self-realization for that character as well. It's when something kind of clicks in their brain about something. And then we have the section called the falling action. And that's when things start to calm down, things start to get kind of tied up. And then we have the section known as the resolution or the denouement. You might have heard it called the denouement. And this is when the tension is quite low, as you can see on the graph, and things very much get resolved. And I think this text in particular, A Christmas Carol, is a lovely, short, simple text. And I think it's really clear what kind of falls into each of these Freytag components. And this is actually one of the questions that I've put on the slide at the end that I'd like you to have a go at. You could either use a blank chart to fill in, or you could just write notes down. But I think it's really obvious which parts of this text fall into these sections. There's also a video that's very good at explaining this as well, which is, I've linked that here for you, called The Origins of A Christmas Carol. So definitely recommend having a look at that video to think more about the fact that this is a short, simple structure. And Dickens, of course, made it that way because he wanted this to be a short, simple book that people could read and just learn a very quick lesson from. We also have a very interesting cyclical structure, of course, cyclical coming from the word cycle. So what happens at the end very much links up with what happens at the what happens at the beginning very much links up with what happens at the end of the text. It really seems like every single thing that Scrooge does wrong in Stave 1, however small it might seem, is righted and is fixed by the end of Stave 5. And there are so many examples of this that I'm going to talk about on the next slide, just a few of them. But we also have other symbols and motifs that kind of start in Stave 1 and conclude in Stave 5. So, for example, we have the coal. In Stave 1, Bob Cratchit is given one piece of coal, and he tries to kind of heat himself up on this one candle as well. And then in Stave 5, Scrooge heaps on the coal. The description is that he heaps it on. So he has he gives he gives Cratchit as much coal as he wants. Or things like the knocker. You know, in Stave 1, this knocker transforms into Marley's face. And then we have a moment in Stave 5, as Scrooge is exiting his house, he looks back at the knocker and he says that he'll never look at it in the same way again, and that he's thankful to the knocker. I think he says he loves the knocker because it's taught him these lessons. That's where it all began. And actually, you could argue that the knocker was part of the inciting incident as well. And then other examples, so like the charity collectors, he refuses to give them money at the start, and then at the end he gives them a very generous sum. And this all shows that he's atoning for his sins. And we could actually argue that this is part of a metaphorical rebirth. So if we're thinking about this in terms of religion, it kind of links in with the idea of baptism and cleansing someone of their sins. He's had really a metaphorical adult baptism. So, he's been cleansed of his sins and he now has a chance to live a new life in the eyes of God, so that he can get his way to heaven and that he can have a pleasurable afterlife. So here are just some examples. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, and there are examples from other staves too, but this is just a couple for you to be aware of. So stave 1, he does not spend money. Stave 5, he spends as much money as he possibly could on a turkey for the Cratchits. Stave 1, he refused to give money to charity, and he says people should go to prison or just die. And then, of course, by stave 5, that's completely different. That second clause here, saying that people should go to prison or die, that changes really at the end of stave 3, when he's shown ignorance and want. Because remember, the ghost repeats his own words back to him. And that's the moment where Scrooge realises that what he said about the surplus population is really out of order. Stave 1 refuses to go to Fred's party, says Christmas is a humbug. Stave 5 goes to Fred's party. Stave 1 does not pay Cratchit enough. Stave 5 raises Cratchit's wages. And then again, not paying Cratchit enough, and kind of not supporting the family enough. But then by stave 5, he treats Tiny Tim very kindly. And we have that quote at the end of the text saying that he becomes a second father to Tiny Tim as well. So it's really, really purposeful on Dickens's part that the beginning of the text links up to the end of the text. So make sure that's something that you talk about, and this cyclical structure, make sure that's something that you mention in your essays wherever relevant. So this idea of, is the text chronological or isn't it? And another way that we describe this is the word linear or non-linear. So I would argue that this text is both. I would argue that there are chronological aspects, but also non-chronological aspects. And I don't think it's as simple as saying it's one or the other, because it's chronological in the sense that we follow the present day older Scrooge. So we follow him all the way through as our protagonist. We see the story kind of from his perspective, in that we only see what he sees. We don't see anything else that Scrooge doesn't see. But on the other hand, when we're in the ghost visits, we do jump around to the past and the future, and the next day with the present. So there are non-linear and linear aspects here. Now, thinking about why this would be, why did Dickens do that? I think some possible readings or inferences here could be, you must look to your past to change your future, you must learn lessons from your past mistakes, and I quite like this one, you can't change your past, but you can change your future. So I think arguing this kind of inference would be really good in an essay as well. And then we have this idea of this kind of supernatural element, that time isn't linear and there are elements of time travel. So he completes all of his visits in one night. The ghosts seem to have played around with time so that Scrooge gets to go just from Christmas Eve to Christmas Day. And the fact that he goes to bed at 2 in the morning but then wakes up at midnight, so he's jumped back a few hours as well there. There is definitely a supernatural element. And actually lots of students read this text as a dream narrative. So there are people, and this is an interpretation you might want to explore in an essay, there are people who believe that this didn't actually happen, that he went to sleep, and that he had a dream and then he woke up, and that the ghosts didn't take him anywhere, he didn't travel out of his bed at all. Some people actually think that what Scrooge says in Stave 1 to Marley is true, the bit where he's saying that he had food poisoning. So some people like to think that actually this is some sort of bad trip after some food poisoning, and that the moment he starts kind of hallucinating is after he eats that evening meal on Christmas Eve. So there's lots of interpretations you could explore. And then finally, this idea of the third person narrator. So it is a text that's written in third person. We have language such as he, it, and Scrooge. It's not written in first person, I. However, we don't get an insight into Scrooge's thoughts and feelings overtly. We are just told his reactions to things when he laughs or cries. So this means it's not what's known as a close third or third person limited text. If it was close third or third person limited, we would actually get some sort of description such as, Scrooge felt sad at seeing Little Fan. All we get is the technique of show don't tell. So we get the technique where Dickens says, you know, a tear was on Scrooge's face, or, for example, when he's at Fred's party having a good time, it says Scrooge laughed heartily. So we get the description of how Scrooge reacts to things, but we don't get an insight into his brain. And again, you'd need to discuss kind of the effect of that in your essay. And the really interesting thing for me is the fact that this narrator is really judgmental, and actually this narrator often makes comments on Scrooge. And I think it's really interesting to think about, who is this narrative persona in this text? Is it Dickens himself, or is it just a made-up person? And this is a question I'd like you to explore in your question slide as well, please. Who do you think this narrator character could be? So, for example, I've got this quote here, calling Scrooge an old sinner, calling him hard and sharp as flint, saying that he doesn't care about things. You know, these are all very judgmental comments, and I think it's interesting to hypothesize who the narrator is. So thank you for watching, and there are 4 questions here that I think would be really valuable for you to have a go at. You could submit these to your teachers as kind of homework or preparation for your assessments, or you could do these in class if you're watching this in class, or you could just do this privately for your own revision purposes. But either way, I think these questions will serve you in good stead. And then, of course, here is a quick PowerPoint slide with lots of links for further study on the theme of structure and plot. So thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful, and good luck with your assessments.